Okay, I think we can get started. Did you all finish all the questions? Some tables claim to be close. I feel like these are the times where I kind of want to give you a quiz. See if you had the same thoughts that I did, or came to a good answer. There are several of them. One of these first ones is about Jewish animosity toward the Gentiles. That's kind of a sticking point. Why do the Jews dislike the Gentiles so much? On the surface, you could say because they have a different religion. Well, fair enough. But at least in my mind, maybe it's because I'm young and a millennial, having a different religion shouldn't be a cause for animosity. Right? Like, why is that an acceptable thing? You have a different religion, so I can hate you? Where do you find that in Christianity? Right? Where do you find that in Judaism? But over time, Jewish animosity toward the Romans develops. Romans in particular, but Jewish animosity toward Gentiles develops. So it's, yes, on the surface, they have a different religion, but if you dig into it, what is the friction underneath that's happening? Some of it, when it comes to the Romans, is that the Romans deified several emperors. So several of the Roman emperors, specifically the early emperors, I don't know if they said it about Julius Caesar, but they certainly start saying it about Octavian, Augustus, and many of the other ones, that they call them gods. And so when they set up statues to these emperors, like you have a picture of the president on, some of you might have a picture of the president on the wall, or we might have one around the church. Is that something to be worshipped? No. For those of you, we just have a very different idea in the modern world. But for those of you that would discourage such a thing, sometimes it's helpful to have a picture of someone to remember to pray for them, because you forget. And I know of a story of a monk that had a picture of Osama bin Laden in his cell. And there was a priest staying at this monastery and walked by each day and saw this picture of Osama bin Laden and wondered why, and eventually became angrier and angrier and angrier until he finally decided to break the rule of silence and talk to the monk and tell him that he shouldn't have a picture of Osama bin Laden. And so he knocked on his door, kind of angry, and asked him about the picture, and the monk said, "That man needs conversion. Do you pray for him?" Just because you have a picture of something doesn't necessarily mean you're supporting it. Sometimes it's because we all need reminders of who to pray for, because we get distracted and we forget and we get busy with life. But this animosity between the Jews and the Romans is happening in their world. The Romans want the Jews to bow down and worship the Roman emperors, because if you remember, we've talked before that Roman religion was as much of a civic duty as it was a religious thing. It was about being a good citizen. You were a good citizen when you did the Roman things, and you were a bad citizen when you didn't. So the Jews didn't like that, of course. The Jewish God is exclusive. The God of the Bible says there is one God. All of these other things that you worship aren't gods, and you cannot worship them. But even that, the Romans eventually sort of allow, because the Jews are unwilling to give on the point. Most of the ethnic groups of the world, they just added some Roman gods into their temples or whatever, and probably went on with their daily lives much like before. But the Jews were particularly thorny about this. But part of it is that there's animosity in both directions. Why do the Romans not like the Jews? Got to think of middle school playgrounds, and then you can see this very easily.
They were hard to bully?
Well, they could be hard to bully. That's part of it. But
They were resistant?
yeah, the Jews could be really stubborn. You know, the Romans are like, some of them, you could say, are trying to find a kind of compromise position, something that they can agree with. And the Jewish people, probably led by the Pharisees and the Zealots, basically say compromise is impossible. There's no hope for negotiation. They won't go into Roman homes. They won't, they would probably, by and large, refuse to patronize Roman businesses in areas outside of, in Jerusalem specifically. Probably in Galilee, there was more interchange. You see some of that if you watch The Chosen and if you study the history, because there was a much greater Gentile presence in Galilee than in Jerusalem itself. But there's a lot of antagonism in both directions. And it's important to know that it's not just the Jews hate the Romans because the Romans want them to worship foreign gods. That's part of it. But, if you have a stuffy religious fanatic in your family, they're actually hard to be around quite often. Because it's like no matter what you do, they get upset about something. And for them just to sit back and breathe, like, this isn't about religious worship. We're just going to eat cake together. Can we decide not to kill each other? And their answer is no. No, and you see this. If you've met some of them, it's just like, get off of your soapbox. Just be a person for a while. Eat chocolate chip cookies and smile and say thank you. And if you're grouchy, then leave. But there is animosity in both directions. And that's important to see. It's not to say that the Jews are right and the Romans are always wrong. There's times where the Romans were probably right, that the people were tough to work with. Because every effort at compromise, let's hope that they were genuine efforts. Some of them may not have been, and there could be reasons in the background there, certainly. But that every effort at compromise would be shot down before it even started. Because it's like, well, you're a Roman. I shouldn't even listen to the words you're saying, kind of attitude. And it's difficult to live together when you behave that way. But there is heavy persecution from the Romans toward the Jewish religion. They want to force them to accept the Roman thing, so they have to fight to keep their faith. This is true, most especially for the Jewish people in Jerusalem around the temple. Judaism doesn't have the same evangelical bent that Christianity has. You can argue about should they and what pieces of the Old Testament are talking about it. I think there's some good arguments to be made. But at the very least, the situation on the ground in this time of St. Paul was sort of, the Jewish attitude was like, well, the Gentiles can all go to hell. If they do, we don't care. We're the Jewish people. We're the chosen ones. God gave us a covenant. You worship sticks and frogs. So there isn't the same evangelical bent. Now, Christianity looks at this in a very, very different way. The Christianity looks back on the blessing of Abraham, that it's supposed to be for the entire world, and the Davidic covenant is supposed to be that the people of Israel will be a light to the nations. That Jesus, from the very beginning of the Christian faith, says, "Go therefore, baptize and teach." That Christianity has this movement of being sent into the world, that it's not enough for you to believe yourself, but that Christianity is a faith to be shared. Now, I think that you can make that argument for Judaism. I think that you can find places in the Old Testament where that same evangelical dimension is at least there in seed form if not in a fully developed thing. But the Jewish people at this time did not have that understanding. Modern Orthodox Judaism is somewhat the same way, that it doesn't have the same kind of evangelical thing. And these problems haven't really changed. So if you go to, there's only a couple places in the US where this happens, but there's a few villages, I think mostly near New York City, that are Jewish enclaves. And like the stores are closed on the Sabbath. You know, in some places the stores will be open, they'll just not sell to Jews, but in other ones they're closed on the Sabbath. And they've even tried to do things like to ban cars and driving, because that's against their interpretation of Judaism. And in some cases it kind of, usually it sticks for a while because the Orthodox tend to be extremely well organized and they tend to get on a bunch of civil committees. And then we have a number of grouchy atheists that usually get into conflict with them and push back. And usually it's struck down and the towns are told they can't do that. But they still try. I think it's important to ponder how we think about the world, that you can look at the world and say it's all bad and it's all going to pieces and we shouldn't be a part of it. That's one way of interpreting things. But in another way, St. Paul considered those same kind of people to be worthy of hearing the message of the gospel. St. Paul considered those same kind of people to be targets for evangelization. You have to remember that he's not going into a world that believes what he's going to say. His world isn't all that different from ours. So there's an important part of how you see things, how you think about things, that we shouldn't be negative in the sense of being dismissive of the world as if there's no hope. Now, we have hope because of Christ. We have hope because of redemption and the work of grace. And people do make choices that are not leading them toward holiness. That's true. But that should be part of what gives us the urgency to proclaim the message, to live it first in our own lives and to share it with other people around us. Because but for the grace of God, they might end up in big trouble. And we might too. So the Jews are upset. And Paul has given this speech. And he gets to this part about going out to the Gentile world and proclaiming the message. And the Jews are like, yeah, no. Not doing this Gentile thing. You shouldn't work with Gentiles. You shouldn't talk to them. That's against the law. But oddly enough, their response is different. So their response is away from the earth. It's not right that he should live. Now that's going to be problematic. Why is that problematic? It's problematic for a number of reasons, but there's several of them that are important. The Jews don't have the right to condemn someone to death. Yes, that's a part of it. The Romans reserved to themselves the right to condemn people to death. Now, should the Jews be condemning Paul to death for proclaiming a different message? That's, for the Jews at the time, that's probably a more difficult question. Today, I think we would answer a resounding no. You might not be very intelligent, but we don't believe in killing people we disagree with. And any temptation in that direction is problematic. Sadly, we've seen a lot of that with the arguments about Donald Trump and January 6th. And this isn't to say that we should support that in one way or another. That's not my point. But when you listen to the rhetoric, it's almost the same words. It's not just that this is an opinion that should be debated, but at best, this is a man who should be in prison and never able to run for political office again, if not kill him outright. That's a very scary thing. I mean, that's a level we've lost something, but it's the same thing that the Jews do here. And their response is not to debate Paul, but to kill him. That's a defense mechanism. That's something that they're doing as a way of solving the problem. Probably because they feel like they aren't going to win a debate with Paul, or they're captured by fear, or they're caught in emotion. There's a bunch of different reasons why you come to this point, but this isn't a good solution to the problem. And the same thing runs straight through our hearts. Like if you had kids and they were arguing about something, very often the argument devolves into physical violence and isn't really about the argument. You can have an argument about whether you should use salted butter or unsalted butter in making chocolate chip cookies. You could wrongly assume you should use unsalted butter. But at the very least, although you might be a little bit confused about what kind of butter to use, that doesn't mean you should die. But this happens quite frequently. We've seen it's happening in the debate about global warming, it's happening in the debate about vaccines and COVID. There's a bunch of those that are actually questions that you can investigate. Is the world warming up or not? You can figure that out. We have temperature gauges. You can measure it. Do the COVID vaccines work or don't they? Another thing that you can measure very easily. But very often what's happening is instead of actually talking about the real rational basis for those positions, it's argued as if it's entirely obvious and you must submit or you do not have a right to speak. So in universities, if a professor questions the global warming narrative, they usually lose their job. That's not an argument. That's rote fideism. Now, one could say, you could think there's global warming or there's not global warming, but like I said, it's investigatable. You can actually look. You can measure things. You can debate. Does the data say this or does the data say this? Is French bread really the best on earth, or are the Italians the masters of bread? You can debate. You could be wrong about that debate too. But it's an actual, you can have these discussions. When the discussion turns from ideas toward hating people, you've lost something. You've missed something. The same thing could be said about the southern border and illegal immigration. Is it a problem? Sure. But good people should be able to disagree about the best solution to that problem and not hate each other. You don't have to burn down your neighbor's house because you think they should have bought a red car instead of a blue one. Or if their yard is full of dandelions, that's also not, an acceptable way to approach it. But you see, my point in talking about some of these things is it's so easy to read and to look and say, oh, look at those people. They're so different than us. Look at what they did. Isn't that obviously wrong? And it's like, we do the same thing a lot. It's happening in our world. It happens to people on the other side of debates. It's like we have to learn to reaffirm human dignity again. That people are human. And ideas can be good or bad, and ideas can be debated. But that shouldn't go against the people. That's exactly what happens here. This happened in the trial of Jesus too. The Jews decided to kill Jesus and they couldn't. So now they have to figure out how to get the Romans to kill Jesus. And they do it by lying and creating a case for political subversion. Here, they want to attack Paul as a person. I wonder, how can this be justified in Judaism? Their claim is that Paul has violated the law because of he's brought a Gentile into the temple. Another thing which could be investigated, there would be witnesses because it's a place where there are people. And you could ask, did he bring this guy into the temple or not? That may be true or false. We don't know. But they don't want to investigate it. They want to kill him. But isn't that against Mosaic law? Thou shalt not kill. I mean, that's not even like Pharisee tradition. That's like 10 Commandment tradition. Those are the kinds of things that you shouldn't go against. And so there's this dripping irony between they're upset with Paul for maybe violating the law, but they're clearly violating the law themselves to kill him.
This question is still there, but how did they balance out the fact that they would stone people, like they stoned Stephen, they stoned for adultery?
Right. So the challenge is, it's hard to know how much stoning did they do. There's some evidence that those may have been thought of more as maximum punishments than as the usual thing. But it's true, there was stoning, and they did some of that. I think this is where you see a development in Christianity, and there's a greater reflection on the dignity of a human person that happens now. Remember that this is a world where slavery is widely accepted. And that would be not widely accepted today, I would think. That we would consider that to be wrong. So, how do they do it? I agree, it's hard. Could you imagine how difficult it would be if you had to sit on a jury and if you voted to convict someone, then you had to kill them? Would any of you want to sit on a jury? Like, if you were sitting on a jury for someone who's being tried, let's say of a heinous murder, they, ran around and shot a police officer and wrecked a bunch of families and did all kinds of things, but you knew that if you voted to convict, that you were also going to be given a gun to shoot them. That would be hard. I'd be like, yep, I'm not coming to that trial. I think I'm sick. I think I have a vacation to Florida planned. Gonna go swim with the jellyfish. So, in some ways, like, this is Judaism. This is part of it. And I don't know. I think there's difficulties involved. I struggle with how they justified it. To me, even exile seems preferable. Like, maybe your ideas are so bad that you have to leave the community and you can't come back, but you could figure out how to live. And maybe that's just a way of making it safer or more comfortable. I don't know. But I think that's a real difficulty. It's a good question. So they decide that they want to kill Paul. They say, away with him, away from the earth. And then they basically start a riot. They start picking up stones and throwing them and causing a havoc. They raise a ruckus. So the commander of the cohort, this is the dude that had rescued Paul before, orders him brought into the compound. And then, because this is one of the things in the ancient world that makes the least sense of all, they routinely tortured people who were witnesses because they believed that if you didn't say it under torture, then you were probably lying. Because that works. But it was like, in the ancient world, you didn't even want to be a witness at a trial because you probably hadn't done something wrong, but your testimony was inadmissible in a lot of cases unless you were being tortured. So they decide to start whipping Paul, probably. And this is a challenge. Like, one would say that we should try and seek the truth, that we should try and work at what is true and what is good. But Paul decides to ask about beating a Roman citizen with the centurion. He asks this question, should you do this? The centurion asks the cohort commander, did you figure out who this guy was? Who is he? You can see, this is the place where he's like, uh-oh, wait a minute, did you do this? And the cohort commander is like, no, the Jews were upset, they were rioting, so we brought him in. He's like, you didn't ask him. No, you're supposed to ask him. He can see the stuff hitting the fan, proverbially speaking. And Paul decides that he's going to let it hit the fan in this case. he raises the possibility of trouble. One of the rights of a Roman citizen was that you could not be tortured to be interrogated. They had to actually just ask you the questions. And so Paul, sort of the centurion or the Roman guy, is like, well, I bought my citizenship for a large sum of money. Paul's response is, I was born one because my parents were Roman citizens, or somehow, however citizenship worked in ancient Rome. And so he's like, oh, this is problem. Okay, you can have some nice clothes, we'll feed you some nice food, everything's fine, right? That's kind of where they're at. They realize that they're in trouble. So now the commander wants to sort it out. He wants to investigate this. And I think I want to look at the text for just a second to make sure I have this in the right order in my head. So, yes, so the next day, the cohort commander frees Paul and tells the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin to convene. And then he brings Paul to stand before them. He wants to know the truth. So he's like, you cannot just condemn this guy. You have to present formal charges. Why does he deserve death? Now, this isn't what the Sanhedrin wants to do. And they're probably even more incensed that they were convened by a Roman. Remember that animosity in the background? That this probably plays out here too, because usually the Sanhedrin would convene because it wants to. In this case, the Romans telling them to. So they're not going to like that. Paul
I have a quick question. This Ananias is not the same one that was in Damascus, right?
The Ananias that's in the story of Paul is. Is there another Ananias?
Well, there's one where he, when he fell off or was struck blind.
Yeah.
And he went to Damascus, and then
Yep.
That's a different Ananias?
Nope, that's the guy. That's the guy in Damascus.
Okay, because when he saw Paul,
Oh, this one. Yes, the Ananias that we're going to get to
yeah.
in a few.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, this Ananias is different.
Okay.
This Ananias is different. So, Paul notes that he conducted himself with a clear conscience, that Paul is not guilty, that he has done what is right. He has had a perfectly clear conscience before God to this day. The high priest Ananias, so this is a different Ananias, the Ananias that's the high priest, orders Paul struck. Now again, should he have done that? Has Paul actually said something wrong? No, it's kind of like in the trial of Jesus. They start beating Jesus. Is that the way you address the high priest? And Jesus' response too is, if I have done wrong, point it out. Like if you have an actual charge, this is the time. This is where Jesus had called the Pharisees whitewashed tombs. That they are whitewashed tombs, that they look good on the outside, but on the inside they're full of evil and malice. And you see it here. Again, Paul had done nothing wrong. He has proclaimed the truth. Now, you could, again, investigate, is Paul telling the truth? That's an investigatable fact. But to just attack him for speaking is wrong. There is this massive biting irony because throughout this trial and throughout trying to convict Paul, they've already basically decided to kill him. And they're just looking for a way. And it's ironic. That's the biting irony of this. Paul, they accuse of breaking the law, but they're willing to lie to convict Paul. That's against the Ten Commandments, yet again. And so you see, it's like they're claiming to care for the Ten Commandments and care for the law of Moses, and this is what Paul has violated. And actually what's going on is they're chucking the law of Moses to the wind because they want to kill Paul. And the Jews, claiming to be holy, are behaving just like Gentiles. This is all political. This is all authority and power. Now, here, it's like they say, well, should you do that to God's high priest? And Paul sort of backs off a little bit. He claims that he didn't know it was the high priest. And then he decides to be political himself. So he notices that this is a mixed crowd of Sadducees and Pharisees, probably because of what they wore. The Pharisees would have had probably the big robes, the prayer shawls, everything. You would have known they were Pharisees. So Paul decides to do a political gambit, which is kind of funny at the end of the day, that he notes that I am on trial for hope in the resurrection of the dead, which the Pharisees believe and the Sadducees don't. And they fall into Paul's trap quite readily. So Paul talks about, see, they were upset about the Gentiles. Should you have gone to the Gentiles? Should you be inviting the Gentiles, this relationship with the Gentiles? Paul resets the debate, not to the Gentile question, but to the resurrection question. That if Jesus rose from the dead, then this debate is reshaped. The entire landscape is reshaped. Now, it could be because he wants to play them off against each other, but one could also say that that's actually the real question. Did Jesus rise from the dead or not? He's going to the heart of the matter. And so he basically pokes the bear. He says that I am on trial for hope in the resurrection. And so the Pharisees respond, well, we should listen to him. We believe in the resurrection of the dead. Perhaps an angel spoke to him. Now, that would be problematic for their ultimate argument with Paul, because if you listen to him, then he's probably going to start saying things. But the Sadducees are like, no, people can't rise from the dead. And what ends up happening is they leave Paul behind. Now the debate is between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and they're going at it. They're mudslinging, and Paul's just sort of on the side. You can see the same thing happen in our own day. Lots of things could be debated. I think we could say they should be debated. Does it work? Doesn't it work? You know, they're building the Fargo diversion project. Does it work? Is it big enough? How do you spend that kind of money to save a city? Is it worth it? You can debate about all of those. But it shouldn't lead to killing people. And what happens quite frequently is that people are played against each other. So, in the early COVID times, Donald Trump decided to plant a stake on hydroxychloroquine. And basically, the entire other side of the political spectrum decided to oppose it. Now, that may be good or it may be bad. It may work or it may not work. People have all kinds of ideas, and there's been all kinds of trials. It hasn't been shown to be very effective. But the problem was that the debate was